You may have noticed that your brain is smaller than the world. This is a problem. If your brain's going to do anything useful with the world, it needs to come up with some sort of reduced representation that can fit within the brain, that can be manipulated to come up with useful thoughts or behaviors in response to the information coming to it from the world. We call this sort of reduced representation a model. So anytime you do any thinking, what you're doing is manipulating a model that your brain has constructed of the world. Unfortunately, most of us are carrying around a sort of naive notion of our relationship to the information coming to us from the world. If we're paying attention, if we're being careful, considerate, thoughtful people, maybe we understand that there's some complexity in the matter. But when we're not paying attention, we just assume that there's a world out there, some independent reality, and we're just perceiving it. This raises some serious problems, because this naive model only has two parts, both of which we sort of think of as immutable. There's the reality that's out there, and reality is always right. That's sort of fundamental. But then there's also just the me that's perceiving. And for better or for worse, most of us perceive ourselves as sort of this immutable identity. That makes it really difficult to navigate situations where I'm in some corner of the universe having an experience, and say Steve is over here, in the same general patch of reality, also having some experience, and we disagree. How can we navigate this disagreement? If we have each of us this naive model of there's an independent reality and I, the immutable I, is just perceiving it, the only way that we can resolve that disagreement is for either me to be wrong in my perception or Steve to be wrong in his perception. And that's inherently personal and confrontational. I wonder which of us I'm going to prefer to assume is wrong. I wonder which one Steve is going to prefer. It's a difficult resolution there. It gets personal because we have to invalidate somebody's experience, and that is a deeply upsetting experience for most people. There's just nowhere to go if we're sort of unconsciously, naively applying this sort of highly, highly simplified model. So we need to improve the model a little bit. There's a lot of room for improvement here, but we're going to try to just make the minimum possible improvement and see what we can extract from that. Two considerations for model improvement. First, reality is very big. Hopefully that's uncontroversial. So it's producing a lot more data than we are able to ingest at any given moment. So we always have to choose a subset of reality to pay attention to, and the data coming in from that enters our senses, and then it has to be processed in order to be experienced in a very reduced representation. Hopefully that's not too controversial either. Like your senses do not take in the constituents of your experience. Your eyeball, millions of photons are streaming in there, and some of them happen to be the right energy level to hit a protein in the little photosensitive patch of your retina and cause it to flip its 3D configuration, setting off a chemical cascade that results in a neural impulse that goes into your brain, and then there's like 40,000 of those a second. Those get turned into the basic constituents of your visual field, and then a whole bunch of processing goes on to do like edge detection, face detection, all of that sort of stuff. So what we finally experience in terms of vision is very different in terms of the actual data flowing in from the environment. There's processing going on. So we have our updated model. We have reality, it's much bigger, there's data coming out in every direction. Our senses can take in just a fraction of that data. They send that over to a processing model, which outputs the constituents of our experience. Now, is this a good model? No, absolutely not. But it's a better model than the naive one. And we're not going to get too far into thinking about modeling and how to use models, but a core thing to consider is that the measure of a model is not like its fidelity to reality, because reality is big and we can't handle it all. We necessarily have to simplify. The measure of a model is how useful it is. Does it take something which was previously murky and make it clear? Does it make something that was previously intractable tractable? This model is going to make some things tractable. So let's look at them. What this model gives us is the ability to ask two really, really important questions. First, what data am I taking in? What subset of the information coming from reality have I chosen to focus on? And second, what processing model am I applying? How am I weighting the information that I'm taking in to arrive at conclusions to generate the thoughts and behaviors that define my interaction with the external world? And variance of these two questions can help us to resolve all sorts of issues and improve our life experience if we just take the steps to really internalize this very slightly improved model and make it our intuitive default. So for example, if Steve and I are in the same little patch of reality, having our experiences, now we can see that we're still always going to end up at a slightly different angle to the situation. So we're going to take in different data from the environment. And on top of that, we're probably going to be applying different processing models. So we can ask the question when we disagree, okay, well, where do we differ in the data that we've taken in? And also, where do we differ in how we're processing that data? Neither of these questions is fundamentally invalidating. There's no assumption that one or other of us is wrong here. We've just made different choices based on different information. So that opens up the possibility of learning a lot more from and about other people's experience, because disagreement isn't fundamentally a challenge to either their experience's validity or my experience's validity. It's just an opportunity to learn about a different way to look at the same circumstances. And that naturally leads into another benefit of this very minor improvement of your model of how your experience of the world gets constructed, which is that it makes it easier to be more flexible about your thinking. Because those two questions, what data am I collecting and how am I processing it, can get turned into, am I collecting the right data to arrive at the sort of conclusions I want to from this experience? And am I applying the right processing model for this? Is there an alternative processing model that I could be dropping in here that's going to cause me to get to a more useful conclusion, a more useful set of thoughts and behaviors about the experience that I'm having than the one that I'm presently having? As soon as we have this data processing model in our conception of how our experience gets put together, suddenly we no longer have an immutable I that's just experiencing. There's a whole set of judgments that are being made about what data to collect, and there's a whole set of judgments being made about how to process it, how to weight it, all of these sorts of things. These are all levers that we can pull on. These are knobs that we can turn to dial in the experience we want to be having. So this naturally makes learning quite a bit easier. If we have these two questions, what data am I taking in and how am I processing that data, we can turn those into the related questions. What data are people who are good at this paying attention to? How are people who are good at this judging this situation? And very often we find that we can just pick up, by probing other people's experience in this way, ready-made models that make it very easy to move within new problem domains. The most eye-opening experience I would say that I had in my education was taking a problem-solving seminar with Professor Paul Zeitz at the University of San Francisco. He wrote the book on problem solving. And he just trained us to walk through a checklist of all of these different important considerations that very often break technical problems. Like, something that is difficult becomes trivially easy if you look at it a certain way. And so looking for symmetry, looking for invariance, considering the extreme cases, looking at how things change as you go from the central case to edge cases, looking for the degenerate cases and seeing at what point relevant complexity and structure emerges. And then if you can capture the complexity in the minimal complex case, then very often you can find something you can generalize that works in all cases above a certain threshold of complexity. All sorts of really cool principles, but these are ready-made, they're off the shelf. And I remember walking around a convention at one point with a friend of mine who was talking about recently having to hire engineers. He worked for a startup, and he was talking about the problems that they were giving these engineers to work on. And he gave me one of them, and I hadn't heard it before. We're walking around a convention floor, and about 5 minutes later, I just sort of said, oh, is this the solution? I just walked down this checklist that I learned, these ready-made models for data processing, and one of them just cracked this problem, made it absolutely trivial to see the answer. That was somebody else's experience, somebody else's genius that came up with tools to solve this problem. I just had to have the flexibility to ingest those tools, to update my model, and to know that I can dynamically ask the question, what's the best data processing model? And then run through a list of ready-made options that I have gathered over the years. But if I am living in the world of the immutable I that can't change perspectives around, it's a lot harder to learn that sort of stuff. So those are 3 benefits of making this very tiny improvement to our model of how our experience gets formed, how our brain carries out the very important operation of reducing a very large and complex reality into something that can be manipulated constructively to produce the sorts of thoughts and behaviors we need to interact with the world around us. This is probably the first in a 3 or 4 part series on effective use of models. So if you're into that sort of thing, hit subscribe, hit the little bell thing, and watch this space.